In the mid-1990s, suburban Seattle seemed like the kind of place where nothing shocking ever happened. Families settled into safe neighborhoods, children biked down cul-de-sacs, and schools were the center of community life. Among the staff at Shorewood Elementary was a young teacher named Mary Kay Letourneau. To parents, she seemed friendly, devoted, and enthusiastic, the kind of educator who threw herself into her students' lives with extra energy. What no one imagined was that she was hiding a secret that would ignite one of the most infamous scandals in American history. It began with what seemed like an ordinary classroom connection. Letourneau was a married woman in her 30s, the mother of 4. One of her students was William Vahey, a 12-year-old boy from a Samoan-American family. Reports later revealed that she spent extra time tutoring him, encouraging his creativity, and involving him in after-school activities. Parents saw it as dedication. But behind the closed doors of that mentorship, the relationship crossed a line. By 1996, whispers began to circulate. Other teachers noticed the closeness. Classmates saw the two together outside school more than seemed normal. At first, the idea that a teacher could be romantically involved with a child was so unthinkable that many dismissed it as gossip. But the rumors hardened into reality when police, acting on a tip, pulled over Letourneau's car late one night. Inside, she was found with Vahey. The truth was undeniable. The arrest stunned the community. A respected teacher, a married mother, had not just broken the law but crossed one of the most sacred boundaries in society, the protection of a child. Prosecutors charged her with second-degree child rape. Court documents described encounters in parks, in her home, even in her car. The revelations hit national headlines within days, sparking outrage and disbelief across the country. The media latched on immediately, painting the story in lurid tones. Tabloids branded Letourneau the teacher lover, while nightly news anchors spoke of betrayal and abuse of trust. Parents recoiled. How could someone tasked with nurturing children instead exploit one? But Letourneau's own reaction added fuel to the fire. Unlike many defendants who expressed shame or denial, she seemed almost defiant. In interviews and court appearances, she insisted she truly loved Vahey. She did not see herself as a predator, but as someone in a forbidden romance. For investigators, it was no romance at all. They emphasized the legal reality. A 12-year-old cannot consent. This wasn't love, it was exploitation. The prosecution's case rested on that foundation, and the evidence was overwhelming. But before the trial even reached its full arc, another shocking revelation hit. In 1997, just months after her arrest, Letourneau gave birth to a child, Vahey's child. The scandal deepened. Images of the teacher holding an infant outside the courthouse plastered television screens nationwide. For many Americans, this was no longer just a criminal case. It had become a disturbing cultural symbol, the collision of authority, innocence, and betrayal. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because even after her conviction and sentencing, the saga of Mary Kay Letourneau and William Vahey was far from over. By the summer of 1997, the name Mary Kay Letourneau had become a staple of nightly news. The arrest of a married schoolteacher for an intimate relationship with her 12-year-old student was shocking enough. But the birth of their first child together elevated the scandal into uncharted territory. When cameras flashed outside the courthouse, the public didn't just see a defendant. They saw a young mother cradling an infant whose father was still in middle school. The trial was swift, but the drama was unrelenting. Prosecutors framed the case with blunt clarity. Letourneau had violated the most basic duty of care. A teacher holds authority, influence, and responsibility. Instead of safeguarding her student, she had abused that trust in the most damaging way possible. They emphasized that no matter how she described the relationship, romance, love, even destiny, the law was clear. A 12-year-old cannot consent. Letourneau's defense attorneys faced a difficult task. They pointed to her troubled personal life, a fractured marriage, emotional instability, and what psychiatrists described as possible personality disorders. But their client often undermined their strategy. In interviews, in letters, and even in court statements, she continued to insist that her feelings for William Vahey were genuine. This defiance fueled headlines and complicated any plea for leniency. In August, Letourneau struck a plea agreement. She admitted to 2 counts of second-degree child rape. The court sentenced her to 7.5 years in prison, but initially suspended the bulk of the term on one condition. She was to have no further contact with Vahey. If she obeyed, she could serve only 6 months in county jail and avoid long-term incarceration. But almost immediately, she broke that condition. Within weeks of her release from county jail in early 1998, police discovered her in a car with Folau once again. The judge's patience snapped. The suspended sentence was revoked, and Letourneau was ordered to serve the full 7 years in prison. Shortly afterward, she gave birth to a second child, also fathered by Folau, while she was behind bars. The contradiction at the center of the case fascinated and enraged the public. To many, she was the embodiment of betrayal, a teacher exploiting her student. To others, her insistence on love, despite the criminal conviction, made the saga feel like a twisted romance novel come to life. News programs and tabloid magazines covered every development, while legal experts warned that her case risked blurring the lines around exploitation. When Letourneau finally walked out of prison in 2004, the story took another turn that stunned observers. Folau, by then 21 years old, petitioned the court to lift the no-contact order. The court agreed. Just 1 year later, in 2005, Mary Kay Letourneau and William Vahey were married in a private ceremony attended by family, friends, and a surprising number of reporters. Their 2 daughters were flower girls. For critics, the marriage was the ultimate insult, evidence that Letourneau had manipulated her way into rewriting the narrative. For supporters, it complicated the label of predator, with the uncomfortable fact that the pair had built a family and sustained it for years. The marriage lasted until 2017, when Folau filed for separation. Mary Kay Letourneau's story never lost its polarizing power. To prosecutors and child advocates, it remained a case study in how authority can be abused under the guise of love. To tabloids, it was a scandal-turned-love story. And to the broader public, it was a reminder of how fragile trust in the classroom can be, and how devastating the consequences when that trust is broken. In the early 1990s, the sleepy town of Derry, New Hampshire, became the unlikely stage for a story that felt closer to a Hollywood thriller than small-town reality. At the center was Pamela Smart, a 22-year-old high school media coordinator who cultivated a glamorous image, stylish clothes, a confident smile, and a role that let her spend extra time with students in film and journalism projects. But beneath the surface, her life was unraveling. Pamela had married Greg Smart less than a year earlier. Friends described the couple as picture-perfect newlyweds, but by 1990, cracks had already formed. Greg had grown distant, and Pamela, barely out of college herself, confided in students about her loneliness. One of those students was Billy Flynn, a 15-year-old who admired her charisma. What began as casual mentorship soon spiraled into something darker. According to later testimony, Pamela and Billy entered into a secret relationship. She showered him with attention and gifts, making him feel chosen. But that relationship soon carried a chilling undertone. Pamela began telling him that Greg was the obstacle to their happiness. Divorce, she claimed, wasn't an option. If they wanted to be together, her husband would have to disappear. Billy Flynn wasn't alone. Pamela allegedly pulled other students into her orbit, teenagers who looked up to her, hung on her words, and soon found themselves part of a deadly conspiracy. In May 1990, the plan turned into action. Greg Smart was found murdered in the couple's condominium, shot execution style. At first, police suspected a robbery gone wrong. But within weeks, rumors filtered through the high school hallways. Students whispered that Pamela had set the whole thing up. The investigation took a sharp turn when those whispers reached detectives. Teenagers began talking, not in full confessions at first, but in fragments that hinted at a conspiracy. Prosecutors later said the unraveling of the case began with small cracks. A student too nervous to keep the secret, another too burdened by guilt. Soon, the story emerged that Billy Flynn and his friends had carried out the killing at Pamela's urging. What transformed the case from a local tragedy into national spectacle was the evidence that followed. Police wired one of Pamela's friends to record conversations with her. On those tapes, jurors later heard Pamela attempting to steer the narrative, warning her friend that if anyone talked, they'd all go down together. To the prosecution, the tapes were gold, proof not only of her knowledge but of her manipulation. By the time the trial began in 1991, the media frenzy was unstoppable. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, and reporters filled the benches. The spectacle of a young teacher accused of seducing students and plotting her husband's murder became irresistible to both tabloids and nightly news. For many Americans, it was their first taste of a trial of the century broadcast into living rooms in near real time. Pamela's defense claimed she was being framed. That the teenagers had acted alone, and that her affair with Flynn, while inappropriate, did not make her a killer. But prosecutors hammered the theme of manipulation, that a young woman with authority and allure had bent impressionable students to her will, turning classrooms into recruiting grounds for murder. The trial was gripping, but the verdict would leave no doubt. And when it came, Pamela Smart's name would be forever etched into true crime history as one of the most infamous teachers turned predators of trust. When Pamela Smart's trial opened in 1991, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a stage. Reporters crowded into the benches, cameras waited outside, and every revelation spilled onto the evening news. The case had all the elements of a media storm: a young teacher, a teenage lover, and a husband murdered in his own home. But what gripped the nation most was the evidence, the tapes and the voices of the teenagers themselves. Prosecutors built their case on two pillars. The first was testimony from Billy Flynn and his friends. One after another, the teenagers described how Pamela had allegedly manipulated them, framing Greg Smart as an obstacle to her happiness and pressuring them to act. Flynn, who admitted to pulling the trigger, told the jury that Pamela's encouragement had been the driving force. His account was emotional, and despite his own culpability, many jurors felt the weight of his youth, only 15 years old when the crime was committed, led astray by a figure of authority. The second pillar was the wire recordings. A friend of Pamela's, secretly cooperating with police, captured hours of conversations. On those tapes, Pamela's voice carried a chilling mix of anxiety and calculation. She warned her friend not to talk, hinted at the consequences if anyone confessed, and tried to keep the circle of silence intact. For jurors, the tapes cut through the defense narrative. Here was the defendant, in her own words, sounding far less like an innocent bystander and far more like a conspirator, desperate to cover her tracks. Pamela's defense team fought back hard. They painted the teenagers as unreliable narrators, eager to shift blame away from themselves. They argued the tapes were ambiguous. The words could be interpreted in multiple ways. They reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence tying Pamela directly to the murder scene. But in the end, the cumulative weight of the students' accounts, combined with her own recorded words, proved decisive. In March 1991, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and witness tampering. The judge sentenced Pamela Smart to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 23 years old, she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The sentence was historic. Pamela became the first woman in the United States to be convicted in a case where the prosecution argued she had manipulated others to kill on her behalf without physically committing the act herself. The media dubbed it a seduction murder case, a label that would follow her for decades. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. Television networks produced documentaries, tabloids ran lurid headlines, and her story inspired the 1995 film To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman. Pamela Smart became a cultural symbol. For some, a cautionary tale about abuse of authority. For others, an example of media sensationalism overwhelming justice. In prison, Pamela has continued to maintain her innocence, insisting she was framed by vindictive teenagers and overzealous prosecutors. Appeals have been filed and denied. Requests for sentence commutation have been rejected. As of today, she remains incarcerated, her name still synonymous with betrayal in the classroom. For the families of Greg Smart and the community of Derry, however, the verdict brought closure. They buried a young husband whose life was cut short not by chance, but by a conspiracy hatched within the very walls of a school. And for America, the case left behind a troubling precedent. When a teacher crosses the boundary between mentor and manipulator, the fallout can end in tragedy. By the mid-2000s, America had already seen its share of scandals involving teachers crossing boundaries with students. But when the name Debra Lafave hit headlines in Florida, the story spiraled far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just the crime that captivated the public, it was how the media portrayed her. In newspapers, on television, and across talk shows, the focus was as much on her appearance as on the law she had broken. Debra was a 23-year-old English teacher at Angelo El Greco Middle School in Riverview, Florida. Fresh out of college, she presented herself as approachable and stylish, often dressed in a way that made her stand out from her colleagues. Students described her as friendly and outgoing. But in 2004, whispers began circulating that she had developed an inappropriate relationship with one of her 14-year-old students. The investigation that followed was swift and damning. Prosecutors alleged that Lafave had engaged in multiple encounters with the boy, in her classroom, in her car, even in her home. The student's mother alerted police after discovering messages and becoming suspicious of her son's behavior. When detectives confronted Lafave, she initially denied the claims, but mounting evidence forced her into a corner. What transformed the case into national spectacle was the way media outlets covered it. Tabloids splashed her photos across their front pages, emphasizing her blonde hair, makeup, and youthful looks. Television anchors described her as too attractive for prison, while talk shows debated whether her appearance influenced the handling of her case. The scandal became not just about a crime, but about the double standards in how society perceived female offenders. Prosecutors charged Lafave with multiple counts of lewd and lascivious battery, crimes that carried the possibility of years in prison. But her defense attorneys pushed hard for a plea deal, arguing that sending her to prison would place her at risk. One attorney famously told the court that putting Lafave in prison was like putting a piece of raw meat in with the lions. The comment sparked outrage, not only for its crude metaphor, but for what it implied about unequal treatment under the law. The victim's family eventually agreed to a plea arrangement to spare their son the ordeal of testifying in court. In 2005, Lafave pled guilty. Instead of a prison term, she received 3 years of house arrest, followed by 7 years of probation. The sentence barred her from working with children, but she avoided incarceration. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some argued the plea was practical, protecting the teenage victim from reliving trauma on the witness stand. Others saw it as proof of a troubling double standard, that a woman deemed attractive and sympathetic could escape prison, while men in similar cases often faced decades behind bars. Editorials raged, radio hosts debated, and the phrase "too pretty for prison" entered the cultural lexicon. For the boy at the center of the case, the glare of publicity was unbearable. His identity remained protected, but the relentless media attention surrounding Lafave ensured the story never truly faded. For critics, the handling of the case sent the wrong message, that some offenders could receive leniency based not on their crimes, but on how the public perceived them. And as Debra Lafave retreated into a quiet probationary life, the debate her case ignited continued to echo. How much does appearance, charm, or gender sway justice when authority figures exploit the children they are meant to protect? When Debra Lafave walked out of court in 2005 with no prison sentence, the storm outside was unlike anything Florida's legal system had seen in years. Parents, prosecutors, and pundits alike reacted with outrage. To many, the decision crystallized a troubling double standard. Would a male teacher who had preyed on a 14-year-old student ever have been allowed to serve only probation? The plea deal had been carefully crafted. Prosecutors defended it as a way to shield the boy from testifying in open court, a process that would have forced him to recount explicit details under cross-examination. The victim's mother had agreed, emphasizing that her son's healing was more important than a trial spectacle. On paper, the deal protected him, but to the public, the optics were very different. Within hours of sentencing, headlines across the country carried phrases like "too pretty for prison," a line lifted from one of Lafave's own defense lawyers. The comment, intended as an argument for her vulnerability behind bars, became a soundbite that dominated coverage. Television anchors debated whether her appearance had tilted the scales of justice. Editorials asked bluntly, if she had been a middle-aged male teacher, would anyone have suggested probation as fair punishment? Families of victims in similar cases spoke out. Advocacy groups accused the courts of sending a dangerous message that female offenders, especially those who fit a certain image, would be treated more leniently than men. The outrage wasn't limited to Florida. National news cycles replayed Lafave's smiling courtroom photos alongside commentary questioning whether the justice system had just revealed a deep cultural bias. The backlash had real consequences. Politicians seized on the case to push for stricter sentencing laws in sex crime cases involving minors, arguing that plea deals should never allow offenders to avoid prison entirely. Prosecutors faced criticism for what some saw as prioritizing expediency over accountability. Judges were pressed in interviews to explain how justice could be served without incarceration. Meanwhile, Lafave herself became a reluctant cultural symbol. Tabloids framed her as the glamorous predator, while late-night comedians mocked the case. Her own attempts to retreat into quiet probation were undermined by paparazzi who followed her relentlessly, photographing her grocery shopping, attending church, even visiting her probation officer. The fascination wasn't just with the crime, it was with the paradox of a woman who looked like a model yet carried the label of felon. For the victim, now entering his teenage years, the frenzy was brutal. Though his name remained shielded, the saturation coverage meant whispers and speculation in his community were unavoidable. His family later described the ordeal as almost as damaging as the crime itself, not just the abuse, but the endless spotlight on the woman who committed it. Years later, when her probation ended, Lafave gave a rare interview expressing remorse and a desire to live quietly out of the public eye. But by then, her case had already carved itself into cultural memory as a shorthand for legal inequity. The fallout of Debra Lafave's plea deal left two indelible lessons: that the justice system's decisions are judged not only in court but in the court of public opinion, and that the intersection of gender, appearance, and crime can expose biases society would rather not confront. In Canadian headlines, she became known by a name that blended menace with intrigue: the Internet Black Widow. But before she was infamous for online matchmaking and a trail of poisoned husbands, Melissa Ann Shepard began her life in a role not unlike other authority figures we've seen in this series: a caregiver, a teacher's aide, a woman entrusted with guiding and supporting others. That reputation of trust became her disguise, the mask she wore while orchestrating one of the strangest and deadliest legacies of betrayal in Canadian criminal history. Her story first emerged in the 1990s, when authorities in Nova Scotia began investigating the sudden collapse of her husband, Gordon Stewart. On the surface, Gordon's health issues looked like the unfortunate fate of a man aging with complications. But the timeline told a darker story. In 1991, just months into their marriage, Gordon suddenly fell violently ill. Tests revealed sedatives in his system, at levels that couldn't be explained by any prescription. He later died in what prosecutors would describe as a carefully staged campaign of poisoning. Melissa's defense at the time was extraordinary. She painted herself as a devoted wife, caring for a man whose health had deteriorated, claiming that if she administered medication improperly, it was out of love, not malice. But prosecutors countered with forensic evidence, pill counts, toxicology reports, and testimony from friends who noted Gordon's decline only accelerated once Melissa entered his life. In 1992, she was convicted of manslaughter and served a short prison term, already raising questions about how a woman who had allegedly weaponized her role as caregiver could walk free so quickly. But Melissa Shepard's story didn't end in Nova Scotia. In fact, prison time only seemed to embolden her. By the late 2000s, she had reinvented herself on the internet, turning to Christian dating websites and matchmaking services to lure new partners. Her profile photos, often showing her with a wide smile, neatly dressed, presenting as both maternal and trustworthy, concealed a pattern that stretched far beyond provincial borders. In 2005, while living in Florida, she married Robert Friedrich, an American she had met online. Within months, Friedrich began suffering strange collapses, episodes of sudden weakness that baffled doctors. Suspicion returned to Melissa. Investigators later accused her of spiking his food and drinks with tranquilizers, a chilling echo of her earlier marriage. Though charges in the US did not stick as firmly as in Canada, the whispers followed her back north. By 2009, she was again active on dating platforms, this time meeting widowers in their 60s and 70s, men looking for companionship. Melissa played the role perfectly: gentle, attentive, someone who seemed to offer comfort after loss. But families of her new partners began to notice alarming patterns. Bank accounts drained, health spirals that doctors couldn't explain, relatives sounding alarms that went ignored until it was too late. What made Shepard so dangerous was not just the method, sedatives slipped into tea, medication swapped in pillboxes, but the charm that cloaked it. Reporters later described her as manipulative in court, but to her victims, she appeared devoted. One neighbor said, "She looked like the perfect companion for an older man, always smiling, always at his side." The truth was far darker. By the early 2010s, police across provinces were comparing notes. Melissa had left behind suspicious deaths and poisonings in Nova Scotia, Florida, and Prince Edward Island. Her reputation as the Internet Black Widow wasn't hyperbole. It was the product of a disturbing pattern, a woman who moved from one relationship to the next, leaving illness, collapse, and sometimes death in her wake. And yet, Despite the trail, Melissa Shepherd kept returning to courtrooms where she downplayed, denied, or reframed her actions as misunderstood devotion. But prosecutors were preparing cases that would reveal her manipulative charm for what it truly was: a cover for premeditated betrayal. By the 2010s, the legend of Melissa Ann Shepherd had caught up with her. No longer just whispers in Nova Scotia or Florida, her name had become synonymous with danger on both sides of the border. Courts and police agencies across provinces, and even internationally, were now piecing together the truth. This so-called caregiver, who once worked as a teacher's aide, had constructed a decades-long pattern of targeting vulnerable men and disguising control as compassion. Her arrests read like a roadmap of manipulation. In Nova Scotia, she was convicted of manslaughter in 19, but the short sentence meant that, within a decade, she was again meeting new husbands and companions through dating platforms. In Florida, the sudden collapse of Robert Friedrich raised alarms. Prosecutors suspected poisoning, but the evidence was elusive. He later died, and Melissa returned to Canada under the shadow of suspicion. Her tactics were consistent. She presented herself as a devoted Christian woman, a caregiver with a soft smile and a patient demeanor. Men who had recently lost wives or lived alone in small communities found her attention comforting. Families, however, often saw the cracks. They noticed financial accounts draining at alarming speeds, wills rewritten under suspicious circumstances, and their loved ones deteriorating almost immediately after Melissa entered the picture. The most dramatic chapter came in 2012, when she married Fred Weeks, a widower she had met online. Within days of their wedding, Fred collapsed during their honeymoon in Newfoundland, suffering symptoms later linked to benzodiazepines, powerful sedatives that prosecutors said Melissa had slipped into his food or drink. Fred survived, and his collapse triggered an investigation that spanned provinces. Forensic tests revealed drug traces in his system, evidence that finally tied Melissa's manipulative charm to a concrete act of poisoning. This time, prosecutors were determined to prevent another cycle of short sentences and early releases. Shepherd was charged with administering a noxious substance and failing to provide the necessities of life. In 2013, she pled guilty. The courtroom heard about her long pattern: husbands in Canada and the United States who had collapsed or died mysteriously after entering her orbit, and the chilling consistency of her methods. Her sentencing sparked public debate. Shepherd received 2 years in prison, a term critics called insultingly short given her history. Families of her former partners spoke out, some calling her a predator who hunts the lonely, others demanding tougher legislation for repeat offenders who use poison as their weapon. Upon release, Shepherd was placed under strict probationary conditions. She was banned from using dating websites, prohibited from contacting men without disclosing her history, and required to report her whereabouts to authorities. Yet the fear lingered. Canadian newspapers openly questioned whether she would obey the conditions or simply find another way to charm her way back into someone's life. The Internet Black Widow title stuck because it fit. Shepherd's legacy wasn't just in the bodies she left behind, but in the way she used modern tools, dating sites, online forums, carefully crafted personal ads to extend her reach. She showed that even in the digital age, the same old mask of care could still hide calculated betrayal. Today, her case remains one of Canada's most infamous examples of predatory deception. A former teacher's aide who turned her reputation for care into a weapon, Melissa Ann Shepherd forced courts, families, and entire communities to confront a nightmare. Sometimes the warmest smile hides the coldest intent. For decades, William James Vahey was exactly the kind of teacher parents wanted their children to have. An American educator with an easy smile and a reputation for organizing adventurous school trips, he worked in elite international schools across the globe, from South America to the Middle East, from Europe to Asia. His resume sparkled, decades of experience, glowing references, and a knack for connecting with students. But behind that facade was a secret so disturbing that when it finally came to light, investigators would call it one of the most far-reaching cases of abuse in educational history. Vahey's pattern began in the 1970s, when he first secured teaching positions overseas. He taught history, coached sports, and ran extracurricular clubs. His specialty, however, was organizing field trips, weeks-long excursions to remote locations, where he was often the sole adult responsible for groups of young boys. Parents trusted him completely. Schools, desperate for experienced staff, rarely questioned his methods, and Vahey knew how to use that trust. The method he employed was chilling in its simplicity. Prosecutors later revealed that he routinely baked or prepared food laced with sedatives, handing them out to students before trips. Within hours, boys would be groggy, compliant, and vulnerable. Vahey kept meticulous records of these encounters, not in notebooks, but in hidden digital files. Encrypted drives later uncovered by investigators contained thousands of images, catalogued with dates and locations, spanning decades. What makes the case even more haunting is how long it went unnoticed. Vahey worked in at least 10 countries, including Venezuela, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Greece, and Nicaragua. At every stop, the pattern repeated. Glowing references, trusted roles, and an undercurrent of whispered suspicions that never quite reached authorities. Some staff recalled boys seeming unusually tired after eating baked goods he provided. Others raised concerns about his close relationships with certain students. But in the transient world of international schools, where teachers moved frequently and records were often incomplete, the dots were never connected. The unraveling began only after Vahey's death in 2014. He had been employed at an elite school in London when colleagues discovered a USB drive in his personal effects. When the contents were unlocked, what they found was staggering: tens of thousands of images documenting decades of abuse. The FBI was called in, and agents launched a global investigation that spanned continents. Authorities later described the case as unique in scope. Unlike most predators who operate in isolated communities, Vahey had built an international circuit. He leveraged the mobility of teaching abroad, the credibility of elite schools, and the vulnerability of children far from home. By the time his record was exposed, hundreds of potential victims were identified, though the true number may never be known. Parents who had once praised him were left devastated. They realized that the man who led their sons on camping trips, who graded their papers, who stood at the front of classrooms as a respected educator, had been quietly orchestrating one of the most systematic betrayals imaginable. And yet, because his crimes came to light after his death, there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no formal verdict. What remained instead was the evidence, the files, the forensic timelines, and the shattered trust of families across the globe. For the FBI, the William Vahey case became a study in how a predator could exploit gaps in international oversight, slipping from country to country without leaving a trace. For parents, it was a nightmare, a reminder that the very role of trusted teacher could be twisted into a mask for decades of hidden abuse. When William Vahey died in 2014, most assumed his career as a globe-trotting teacher would be remembered in glowing terms. But within weeks, the discovery of a single USB drive in his possession detonated into one of the largest international child protection investigations in history. The drive, passed to administrators at the London private school where Vahey had last taught, contained tens of thousands of images and videos. Digital forensics teams described it as a chilling archive, photographs catalogued by date, location, and sometimes even by school trip. The files stretched back decades, documenting incidents in nearly every country where he had worked. Authorities called in the FBI. What started as a local inquiry in Britain expanded overnight into a global operation. Agents began tracing Vahey's employment history, mapping his movements from Venezuela to Indonesia, from Saudi Arabia to Nicaragua, from Greece to London. At every stop, investigators identified potential victims, students who had been in his classes, on his trips, or under his supervision. The scope was staggering: thousands of children across more than 10 countries. Parents who had once praised Vahey now received devastating phone calls. Former students were interviewed, sometimes decades after the fact. Many described memories of feeling drowsy after eating food he prepared on trips, or of gaps in memory they could never explain. Others recognized themselves in the images found on the drive. For families, the revelations were both confirming and crushing. The unease they once brushed aside had been rooted in reality. What shocked investigators most was how Vahey had evaded scrutiny for so long. Despite a criminal conviction in the US in the 1960s for inappropriate behavior with a child, he had gone on to secure positions at prestigious international schools. References were glowing, records incomplete, and background checks often superficial. The transient nature of expatriate education, teachers moving every few years, schools eager to fill roles, created a perfect cover. The FBI called Vahey's case unique in modern history, not because of the methods he used, but because of the sheer breadth. Most predators operate locally. Vahey exploited mobility, moving whenever questions arose, carrying his crimes across borders where oversight could not follow. The fallout was immense. International schools faced lawsuits, governments launched reviews of how foreign teachers were vetted, and parents demanded reforms. Britain's National Crime Agency warned that Vahey's career highlighted a systemic vulnerability. Predators could reinvent themselves abroad, shielded by paperwork gaps and cultural deference to teachers. Because Vahey was already dead, there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no verdict handed down in a courtroom. Families were denied the catharsis of seeing him held to account. Instead, the reckoning came through the revelations themselves, the images, the testimony, the institutional failures laid bare. For survivors, the tragedy is compounded by silence. Many of them were too young at the time to fully understand what happened. Others only realized decades later, when investigators showed them evidence. Some have chosen to speak publicly, framing Vahey as not just an individual predator, but a symbol of how unchecked trust can be weaponized. By the time the investigation closed, authorities could confirm only a fraction of his victims. The rest remained shadows in the archive, names lost to time, but their trust betrayed all the same. The William Vahey case stands as one of the darkest in educational history, a global reminder that the figure of the teacher, long seen as a guardian and guide, can also be exploited as the ultimate disguise. In the quiet suburbs of England during the mid-2000s, John Tackaberry was, at first glance, the kind of teacher parents could trust. He taught in a primary school, a role that carried with it the authority of nurturing, guiding and protecting children at their earliest stages of education. Parents saw him as approachable, staff described him as diligent, and the community regarded him as part of the safe fabric of school life. But that carefully built image unraveled when a small but crucial act of vigilance by a parent set in motion one of the most alarming cases in modern British education. A parent, suspicious of his behavior outside the classroom, voiced concerns to the school administration. It wasn't about overt misconduct in the playground or in lessons. It was subtler, something in how he spoke, how he lingered. Authorities, trained to tread carefully, opened a quiet inquiry. That report opened the door to an investigation that would reveal the dark double life of a man entrusted with children's care. Police turned to his home computer. Forensic IT teams, using specialized recovery software, combed through hard drives, email caches, and hidden directories. What they found was damning. Thousands of indecent images of children, meticulously categorized, many of them downloaded and traded through shadowy online networks. Unlike cases that rely heavily on testimony, Tackaberry's downfall came from data. Investigators presented clear, time-stamped logs that showed when files were accessed, downloaded, and stored. Deleted folders were resurrected with forensic tools, painting a timeline of behavior that stretched back years. It was no accident, no one-off lapse. It was systematic. The school community reeled. Parents who had once entrusted their sons and daughters to his classroom now faced the unbearable truth. The man who had marked their spelling tests, who had organized assemblies and after-school activities, had been hiding behind the safety of the teacher's desk while engaging in crimes far removed from any notion of education. Neighbors described the shock as total. "We never suspected a thing," one told local reporters. "He was polite, always said hello." To think he was living that kind of life, it's terrifying. In the courtroom, the evidence was so overwhelming that the case was less about proving guilt and more about reckoning with the breach of trust. Prosecutors detailed the trove of images, the patterns of online activity, and the sheer scale of his offenses. Parents filled the gallery, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. The verdict was guilty. Tackaberry was convicted of possessing and distributing indecent images of children. The judge, in sentencing, emphasized the breach of trust at the heart of the case. A teacher, charged with safeguarding children, had instead immersed himself in their exploitation. His conviction sent ripples through the UK education system. Safeguarding policies were tightened, digital monitoring stepped up, and the case became a reminder that vigilance doesn't end at the school gates. One parent's instinct had sparked the investigation that finally brought his hidden life into the light. For the community, however, the damage was lasting. Tackaberry's name became synonymous with betrayal, proof that even the most trusted roles could conceal darkness when oversight fails. When John Tackaberry finally stood trial in the UK during the 2000s, the mood inside the courtroom was tense, almost suffocating. The prosecution's case was not built on ambiguous testimonies or hazy recollections. It was built on hard drives, timestamps, and the inescapable logic of digital forensics. Specialist IT investigators took the stand, explaining how deleted folders had been resurrected, how hidden caches of files could be traced to his personal devices, and how his online activity left a breadcrumb trail across chat logs and download histories. The jury didn't have to imagine. They were shown, step by step, how the evidence had been uncovered, catalogued, and verified. Every image, every file was a digital signature that tied back to Tackaberry. Parents of his students sat in silence, many struggling to reconcile the man they had once entrusted with their children's first lessons in reading and writing, with the individual now being described as part of an underground network of exploitation. For them, the betrayal was not abstract, it was personal. Their children had walked into his classroom every morning, recited their times tables under his gaze, and carried home spelling tests signed by his hand. The distance between teacher and offender was now impossible to ignore. The judge, in sentencing, underscored that very point. Tackaberry, he said, had committed not only criminal acts, but a profound breach of trust. The classroom was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where children could be safe and grow under the care of adults dedicated to their development. To exploit that position for personal obsession was, in the court's words, a violation that strikes at the heart of community trust. The outcome was clear. Tackaberry was convicted and sentenced to a prison term commensurate with the scale of his crimes. The severity of the sentence reflected both the volume of material uncovered and the aggravating factor of his position as a teacher. The fallout extended well beyond the prison gates. In the wake of his conviction, UK schools faced pressure to overhaul safeguarding policies. Local authorities reviewed how parental complaints were escalated, ensuring that concerns, however subtle, would no longer be brushed aside. IT monitoring systems were tightened, with staff computers subject to more stringent checks. Training programs were rolled out to help teachers and administrators recognize warning signs, not just in students, but in colleagues. For parents, the case was both devastating and validating. The single parent who had first raised suspicions now stood as proof that vigilance matters, that intuition can be the spark that prevents years of hidden harm. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The damage done to community trust, to the perception of teachers as inherently safe figures, could not be undone by any single sentence. John Tackaberry's story became a cautionary tale, cited in safeguarding seminars and child protection conferences. It illustrated how modern technology could expose hidden crimes, but also how it could enable them if left unchecked. And in the end, what lingered most wasn't just his conviction, but the chilling reminder, sometimes, the threat isn't an intruder outside the school gates, but someone already standing at the front of the classroom. James Hooker, a high school business teacher in his early 40s, stunned his community when he resigned from his job, left his wife of 2 decades, and moved in with one of his own students, an 18-year-old senior named Jordan Powers. The scandal unfolded like a soap opera, but was very real. Hooker was not just any teacher, he was well known, active in school activities, and the father of multiple children himself. Powers was a teenager on the brink of graduation, navigating the fragile transition into adulthood. When the relationship became public, it hit every nerve in American society, the taboo of teacher-student romance, the imbalance of power, and the moral outrage at a grown man walking away from his family for someone barely out of childhood. Media outlets descended on Modesto. National television shows aired interviews with Powers, who defended her decision and described their connection as genuine love. Hooker himself told reporters that while the relationship was unconventional, it was consensual, legal, and heartfelt. Critics, however, saw something darker: grooming. Powers admitted that she and Hooker had first connected when she was still underage, though both insisted physical intimacy began only after her 18th birthday. The imagery was striking. Hooker, gray-haired, middle-aged, walking hand-in-hand with a teenager in jeans and a hoodie, became a symbol of everything people feared about blurred boundaries in schools. Parents questioned how a teacher entrusted with their children's education could cross a line so profoundly. Social commentators weighed in, pointing to the power imbalance. Even if she was technically of age, the dynamic of authority and dependency could not be ignored. Inside the school, the fallout was immediate. Colleagues were stunned, students whispered, and administrators scrambled to reassure families that safeguards were in place. Hooker resigned under pressure, citing the relationship as incompatible with his professional duties. His wife, blindsided, filed for divorce. His own daughter publicly distanced herself from his choices, condemning the relationship. Public opinion fractured. Some defended Hooker and Powers as consenting adults who deserved the right to make their own choices. Others saw it as predatory, a betrayal of professional ethics, and an example of how authority figures could exploit vulnerable students. The frenzy only grew when television cameras captured Powers moving into an apartment with Hooker. Their life together became tabloid fodder, dissected by talk shows and morning news segments. Commentators drew comparisons to infamous cases like Mary Kay Letourneau, though with a key difference: Powers was legally an adult when the relationship became public. Still, the story carried an aura of unease. The question lingered: if the bond had started when she was younger, how blurred were the boundaries really? How much had been hidden until she turned 18? What began as a local scandal had now ballooned into a national debate on consent, power, and the responsibilities of teachers. And yet, the James Hooker saga was far from over. In the years to come, his name would resurface in ways that cast the entire affair in an even darker light. For a time, James Hooker and Jordan Powers insisted their relationship was proof of unconventional love, a story of two people standing against public outrage. But as the media storm raged, cracks began to appear. The headlines that had once focused on the scandal of a teacher leaving his wife for a teenage student soon shifted to something more serious: fresh allegations of misconduct from Hooker's past. What had seemed like a controversial romance now began to look like part of a pattern. Prosecutors moved forward. Hooker was arrested and charged with sexual misconduct involving the underage student from his earlier teaching years. The timing was devastating, both for him and for Powers. Only weeks after defending their relationship on national television, Powers broke off all contact. In a televised interview, she said she felt manipulated, admitting that the new allegations had forced her to see their bond in a different way. "I don't know what was real anymore," she told reporters. The courtroom proceedings marked a dramatic reversal. Hooker, once defiant, now appeared subdued as prosecutors outlined evidence, including testimony from former students. While some charges were eventually dropped or modified, the damage to his reputation was complete. He had become, in the eyes of the public, not a misguided romantic, but a predator cloaked in authority. The media frenzy intensified. Talk shows dissected the case as an example of grooming, pointing to the blurred line between consensual relationships and exploitation when power dynamics are involved. Legal experts highlighted how even if the Powers relationship was technically lawful, the broader pattern suggested grooming that had started before she was of age. For Hooker, the personal consequences were absolute. His marriage was gone, his teaching license revoked, his career destroyed. Powers moved on with her life, publicly expressing regret and emphasizing that she had been too young to fully grasp the imbalance in their relationship. Hooker faded from the spotlight, but his name remained etched in the catalog of teacher scandals that reshaped how schools talk about boundaries and ethics. The legacy of his case is layered. On the one hand, it sparked national debates on consent, the role of teachers, and the vulnerabilities of students. On the other, it became a cautionary tale of how media coverage can sensationalize tragedy, turning young people into public figures overnight. By the end, James Hooker's story was no longer about a teacher who left his family for love. It was about a man whose choices blurred ethics, destroyed trust, and revealed how thin the line can be between guidance and exploitation. His fall from respected educator to national scandal stands as a warning that in education, boundaries are not suggestions, they are lifelines. For decades, Graham Ovenden occupied a strange space in British culture. He was both a respected artist and an art teacher, admired in some circles for his paintings and photography, and even exhibited in major galleries. His works, often centered on childhood and innocence, were praised by critics as provocative, ethereal, and steeped in Victorian influences. But behind the artistic veneer, Ovenden concealed a disturbing truth. His so-called art education blurred into exploitation. The seeds of suspicion had been sown long before any trial. Parents whispered about the way he photographed children, sometimes nude, sometimes in unsettling poses he defended as part of a tradition of artistic study. Ovenden brushed off concerns as prudishness, claiming he was continuing the legacy of classical art. But the line between art and abuse was not just blurred, it was crossed. By the 1990s and 2000s, more than whispers began to surface. Former models and students came forward with allegations, describing how Ovenden had manipulated them under the guise of art lessons. They testified that what was presented as education often became invasive, exploitative, and degrading. His role as both teacher and mentor gave him the power to frame misconduct as part of the artistic process, leaving his victims confused and intimidated. The turning point came when police seized photographic material during a series of raids. Forensic examination of his archive revealed indecent images of children, some allegedly captured during his so-called sessions. Prosecutors argued that Ovenden had constructed an entire artistic career as a shield for predatory behavior, using the prestige of galleries and the language of fine art to mask abuse. In 2013, Ovenden was tried and convicted on multiple counts of indecency with children and indecent assault, crimes dating back to the 1970s and 80s. Victims bravely testified in court, describing how what began as admiration for an artist teacher turned into trauma. The judge condemned him for exploiting his position of trust, saying his actions had been calculated and deliberate. The aftermath was swift and severe. Galleries pulled his works from display, institutions that had once praised him quietly distanced themselves, and the art world itself was forced into reckoning. Critics who had defended his controversial photography now faced questions about complicity, about how the language of art had allowed abuse to remain unchallenged for so long. Ovenden's conviction left his legacy in ruins. No longer celebrated as a controversial genius, he was branded instead as a manipulator who weaponized art education. Families of his victims spoke out, saying that the conviction brought some measure of closure, though nothing could erase the years of harm disguised as creativity. The case of Graham Ovenden stands as a chilling reminder. Even the most prestigious roles, artist, teacher, mentor, can be twisted into tools of exploitation when society's deference and institutions' silence allow it. His downfall was not just personal. It was a warning that no title, however respected, should shield anyone from scrutiny when trust and innocence are at stake. On the surface, Peter Tobin was unremarkable, a handyman, a church volunteer, and a man who slipped in and out of communities across the United Kingdom without much attention. But in reality, Tobin was one of Britain's most dangerous predators. His crimes would eventually link him to multiple killings, earning him the label of a convicted serial killer. And chillingly, part of his cover came from the role he played in church youth programs, where he styled himself as a teacher of the Bible. In the mid-1990s and early 2000s, Tobin found his way into congregations by presenting himself as devout and helpful. He volunteered for children's groups, leading Bible classes, quoting scripture, and earning the trust of families who saw him as a moral figure. Parents assumed their sons and daughters were safe under the guidance of a teacher of faith. That role, religious mentor, community helper, became the perfect disguise. But behind the mask of piety, Tobin carried a darker history. He had already served time for violent crimes, including sexual assault. Yet with every move, he managed to reinvent himself, changing names, altering records, and inserting himself into new circles. His ability to cloak himself in the trust of a religious role allowed him to continue unnoticed for years. The truth only began to surface after the 2006 murder of Angelica Cluck, a young student who volunteered at a Glasgow church where Tobin worked as a handyman. When she disappeared, suspicion fell on Tobin. Her body was soon discovered buried beneath the floor of the church, a horrifying revelation that shattered any illusions about his role as a trusted figure. Police began digging into Tobin's past, both figuratively and literally. Forensic investigators deployed specialist cadaver dogs, trained to detect the faintest scent of human remains. Their work led detectives to a former property in Margate, Kent, where the dogs alerted to the garden. Excavations uncovered 2 shallow graves. Inside were the remains of teenagers Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, both missing for more than a decade. The discoveries stunned the nation. Tobin, who had once read Bible verses to children, was now unmasked as a serial killer with a string of victims across decades. Prosecutors argued he had used his roles, handyman, church volunteer, even teacher of youth groups, to hide in plain sight, blending trust with predation. Court proceedings revealed his chilling pattern, targeting vulnerable young women, concealing his crimes with calculated precision, and moving across regions to avoid detection. Forensic timelines, DNA evidence, and testimony combined to build a damning case. Tobin was convicted of the murders of Cluck, Hamilton, and McNichol, each conviction bringing a life sentence. Journalists and criminologists later speculated that Tobin might have been responsible for far more killings than the 3 confirmed. Some investigators linked him to unsolved cases stretching back to the 1960s, though conclusive evidence never emerged. Tobin himself offered no clarity, alternating between silence and cryptic remarks that only deepened suspicion. For communities where he once played the role of Bible teacher, the betrayal cut deep. Parents had entrusted him with their children in sacred spaces, never suspecting that beneath the hymns and scripture, he concealed a history of violence. By the time of his death in prison in 2022, Tobin's name had become synonymous with hidden danger. His case serves as a stark reminder that predators often wear masks of respectability, roles that society instinctively trusts, like mentor, teacher, or guide. In Tobin's case, the mask was the Bible, but the reality was a man who turned sanctuaries into hunting grounds. Across centuries and continents, the classroom has always symbolized sanctuary, a place where children walk in clutching pencils and notebooks, where parents wave goodbye at the gates with the quiet certainty that their sons and daughters are safe. But the cases we have explored show how quickly that sanctuary can be corrupted when trust itself becomes a weapon. From Mary Kay Letourneau in Washington to James Hooker in California, we saw how teachers blurred the line between mentor and manipulator, turning authority into influence that reshaped entire lives. From John Tackaberry in the UK to William Vahey across international schools, digital forensics revealed predators hiding in plain sight, their crimes unearthed not by chance but by persistent parents and IT experts willing to dig deeper. Melissa Ann Shepard, the so-called Internet Black Widow, carried the aura of a caregiver-educator but twisted it into a cycle of manipulation that spanned borders. And Graham Ovenden, cloaked in the respect of art and academia, transformed education into an excuse for exploitation. The themes tie together with painful clarity: power imbalance, the fact that a teacher's word can silence doubts, that authority itself can disarm both parents and children. Trust destroyed, families sending their children into schools or youth programs, never imagining betrayal would come not from a stranger, but from the very figure assigned to protect. Systemic blind spots, institutions reluctant to escalate concerns, administrators unwilling to confront suspicions, communities too deferential to question a teacher's intentions until it was too late. Courtrooms became the only places where truth was untangled. Forensic specialists introduced USB drives, phone logs, recovered images, and data-mined patterns as the new blackboards of justice. Victims' testimonies became the lessons written in the margins, stories of betrayal, manipulation, and survival. Judges handed down life sentences, not only as punishment, but as acknowledgement of the profound breach of trust. And yet, even with convictions secured, the scars remain. Survivors live with questions that echo long after the trials. How early did it begin? Who else knew? Why wasn't it stopped sooner? Parents, too, carry the guilt of trust, of believing the classroom was always safe, of discovering too late that safety had been an illusion. That is the emotional core of this entire series. Classrooms turned into hunting grounds, chalkboards replaced by cover stories, and lesson plans masking predation. These cases show us that vigilance is not paranoia, it is protection. That oversight is not bureaucracy, it is the barrier that stands between innocence and exploitation. And so, the final image lingers, a parent's hand letting go of a child's at the school gate, a gesture of trust repeated millions of times each day across the world. When that trust is honored, education becomes liberation. But when it is betrayed, it becomes the deepest wound imaginable, a reminder that the role of teacher, sacred in its responsibility, can be twisted into the ultimate disguise for harm. This was Classrooms of Betrayal, the most evil teachers in history.